Before Jimbo Fisher was coaching the Aggies in College Station, he was building one of the best programs in the country down in Tallahassee, Florida. Following the 2012 season that saw Florida State go 12-2, there was a lot of hype and optimism around the program heading into the 2013 season. Jimbo Fisher was starting his fourth year as the head coach of Florida State and was already doing an outstanding job. That success was both on the field and in recruiting. In 2010, Florida State had the eighth best recruiting class in the country, followed by second in 2011, third in 2012, and 11th in 2013. With those recruiting rankings and the on-field success, you can see why the hype and expectations were very high. They were collecting talent and building up one of the strongest rosters we've seen in recent college football history. Taking a look at the roster, it all starts with number 5, quarterback Jameis Winston. The eventual Heisman Trophy winner stepped in as a redshirt freshman and was the leader of this team from the very beginning. Alongside him in the backfield at running back, you had the dynamic duo of Devontae Freeman and Carlos Williams. Out wide at receiver, they were led by Kelvin Benjamin, Rashad Green, and Kenny Shaw. They also had one of the best tight ends in the country, Nick O'Leary, who served as Jameis Winston's outlet in the passing game. Up front, blocking for these great skill players was a top 5 offensive line during the 2013 season. Led by Brian Stork, the best center in the country, and Cameron Irving at tackle, the Seminole offensive line was one to be reckoned with. This group of offensive players was a part of the second best scoring offense in the country. The Seminoles averaged a crazy 51.6 points per game. To put that in perspective, that would have been first by 5 points per game in the 2022 season. Not only the 2022 season, but it would have been the highest scoring offense every season from 2014 to 2021. Let's switch it over to the defensive roster. Starting up front on the defensive line, they were led by the best front four in the country. Eddie Goldman, Timmy Jernigan, Christian Jones, and the leader of the pack, Mario Edwards Jr. They also had a great young star in DeMarcus Walker as a backup option. At linebacker, they were led by Telvin Smith, who tallied 90 tackles and 9.5 tackles for loss. The secondary was one of the best positional groups in all of college football during the 2013 season. They were led by senior safety LaMarcus Joyner, who was an All-American that year. Alongside Joyner, they also had Ronald Darby, P.J. Williams, and Gerald Demps, not to mention Terrence Brooks and a young Jalen Ramsey. To this day, we have seen very few defensive back groups with the depth that this group had. Now that we know what this roster looks like and how talented they were, let's take a look at this coaching staff. Starting at the top, we have head coach Jimbo Fisher. Coach Fisher also served as the offensive coordinator. They ran his multiple offensive scheme that he's been running for quite some time now. With the personnel that the Noles had, this offense allowed everyone to play to their strengths, and that's why the credit must be given to Jimbo. Next to Jimbo was quarterback coach Ray Sanders, who at the time was regarded by many as the top assistant in the country at the position. Flipping it over to the defensive side of the ball, they were led by defensive coordinator Jeremy Pruitt. Coach Pruitt also served as the defensive backs coach while calling plays. There should be no surprise that Florida State was so good on defense when they had Pruitt on staff. He has led some of the best defenses we've seen in college football just in this past decade. When he was at Alabama after Kirby Smart's departure, he recruited, coached, and developed a great number of eventual NFL draft picks. He ran his famous 4-3 multiple scheme that dominated college football for many years. Having Jeremy Pruitt on staff is just another reason why the 2013 Seminoles were so good. To finish up the video, let's take a look at the schedule for Florida State and how they got to their 14-0 record and a national championship victory. Starting out in Week 1, they played Pittsburgh on the road. At the time, Florida State was ranked 10th in the AP poll. Pitt scored the first touchdown of the game and went up 7-0 early in the first quarter. After that touchdown, this game was all Florida State. They outscored the Panthers 41-6 over the remaining course of the game. With 533 total yards of offense, Florida State won the game 41-13 and moved to a 1-0 record on the year. Heading into Week 2, FSU is still ranked 10th in the polls. They're facing off against the Nevada Wolfpack. There's not much to say about this game other than the Noles outgained them by 400 total yards. The huge yard discrepancy also showed up on the scoreboard as they won by a score of 62-7. Week 3 was the first time we saw a rise in the polls for Florida State. They moved up to number 8 prior to their matchup with Bethune-Cookman. Like the Nevada game, this was really no contest as the Noles won the game 54-6. Remaining 8th in the polls, Week 4 was different from their prior 3 games. Facing off against Boston College, I'm sure there were very few people who expected this game to go the way it did. Boston College was winning 14-3 after the first quarter ended. The Noles got it together in the second quarter and were leading 24-17 at halftime. Jameis Winston lit it up in the second half as he led Florida State to a 48-34 victory. This would end up being the closest regular season game of the season for the Seminoles. Week 5 was the first time Jimbo Fisher saw a ranked opponent on his schedule. Maryland entered the game ranked 25th in the country. To put it slightly, this game was never close. Florida State outgained the Terps by nearly 400 yards and won the game 63-0. Winston and company had 430 yards passing and 5 touchdowns through the air. After the blowout win versus Maryland, Florida State moved up to 5th in the rankings. That set up a top 5 matchup on the road versus Dabo Swinney and the Clemson Tigers. Both teams entered the game with a 5-0 record and had superstars all over the field. Taj Boyd and Sammy Watkins on one side versus Jameis Winston and Calvin Benjamin on the other. This game had a lot of hype, and rightfully so, but it didn't live up to it. Florida State dominated this one from the start, leading 17-7 after the first quarter. The Noles took the momentum and never looked back. They led in the fourth quarter by a score of 51-7. Florida State put up nearly 600 yards of offense and forced the Tigers into 4 turnovers. They won 51-14 after Clemson scored a touchdown with just 13 seconds left. The Wolfpack of North Carolina State were the next victims on the schedule for Florida State. It's never good when you're the team traveling to Tallahassee to play a top 3 team in the country. Gaining nearly 600 yards once again and forcing 3 turnovers on defense, Florida State won the game 49-17 and moved to 7-0 on the season. Just like the Clemson game, we saw Florida State match up with a top 10 opponent, and this time it was the Miami Hurricanes. Failing to gain 300 yards of offense, Miami never had a chance in this one. The Seminoles dominated the first half, leading 35-14 at the break, and it was much of the same in the second half. They ended up winning the top 10 matchup by a score of 41-14. Moving up to number 2 in the polls, Florida State's next 4 opponents were all unranked at the time of the matchup. They beat both Syracuse and Wake Forest by a score of 59-3. In the Wake Forest game, the Seminoles only had 290 yards of offense, but their defense forced 7 turnovers. They had 2 defensive scores and a kickoff return for a touchdown. After beating Syracuse, they were matched up with Idaho. This was the worst game of the entire 2013 season. To put it short, Florida State dominated as expected and won this game 80-14. Heading into rivalry week, Florida State sat at number 2 in the polls behind top-ranked Alabama. The Noles were matched up with the Florida Gators, and they handled business once again. Dominant on both sides of the ball, they beat the Gators 37-7. Florida State earned their place in the ACC championship game and faced off against the Duke Blue Devils. This game was just like every other game for the Seminoles. Dominating in all phases, there was never a doubt they would win this game. Gaining 570 total yards and only allowing 230, they won the game 45-7 and took home the ACC championship. This victory placed them in the national title game versus the Auburn Tigers. To get here, Auburn upset number 1 Alabama with the infamous kick 6 return by Chris Davis. They then beat Missouri in the SEC championship game, and that gave us number 1 versus number 2 for the championship, and it delivered in a big way. Early on, the game was dominated by Auburn, especially at the line of scrimmage. The Tigers tallied 232 rushing yards and jumped out to a 21-10 lead at the half. Second half adjustments and comeback victories didn't become the theme for Florida State until 2014, but we got an early glimpse of that in this game. Early in the fourth quarter, trailing 21-13, Jameis Winston put together a great drive that ended in a touchdown. This was maybe a hint of what was to come later in the game, but following an Auburn field goal by Cody Parkey, Kermit Whitfield had a kickoff return for a touchdown, and Florida State took away all the momentum from Auburn. Nonetheless, the Tigers weren't going to give this game away without a fight. With a minute and change left in the game, Trey Mason took a handoff 37 yards for a touchdown, giving Auburn a 31-27 lead. With a minute left, it was up to Heisman Trophy winner Jameis Winston to lead his team to victory. After a big play to Rashad Green, the Seminoles were threatening. With 13 seconds left, Jameis Winston dropped back the pass and threw a high ball to Calvin Benjamin, who caught the game-winning touchdown. It is remembered as one of the greatest plays of all time and one of the best games ever played, and it was also the perfect ending to a perfect season. All in all, there is no denying how great the 2013 Florida State Seminoles were. One of the best seasons and one of the best teams of the modern era. It's a team that both Seminole and college football fans won't ever forget.